I'm deep into a midlife crisis, so after picking up the obligatory convertible, we decided to do something with it, the NC500. Now, a two-wheel drive convertible might not be the best car to do the NC500 at the end of October, but we rolled the dice and went for it. Day one saw us driving 210 miles to Octorada, which kind of broke up the journey to the start of the NC500. We had decided to splash out a little bit, so our first accommodation was Cairn Lodge in Octorada. It's a beautiful hotel and the food was great too. This night in Scotland was actually a bit of a bonus. Originally we were going to drive all the way to Loch Ness on the first day, so we had some extra time and we decided to drive from Octorada to Fort William to Fort Augustus to a castle on the banks of Loch Ness and then to the hotel in Loch Ness. This was a great choice. The roads up around Fort William, Glencoe are absolutely beautiful and really set us up for what was about to come next. Around this area, Jimmy Savile had a house and you can see where it's been vandalised. Bit of a weird one, I know. We also visited a family member in Fort William at their lovely guest house, Lauriston House. Little recommendation if you fancy it. That's their dog, Dougie. We also visited this viewpoint and you can see Ben Nevis from there. We drove along until we hit Urquhart Castle. Urquhart Castle was amazing. It had a trebuchet in the grounds and some wildlife. The castle is largely ruined, but there's enough there for you to imagine what it would have been like to live on the banks of Loch Ness in the past, with these different sort of clans owning various areas. We also then went to Loch Ness Lodge and had one of many cheese boards. Waking up the next morning, we got a real sense of the beauty, and there was a deer eating outside the window, which was really cool, and we got ready to set off. We didn't make many mistakes on this trip, but the first one was doing too little distance on the first day. This meant that we had more to do later in the week, which would become a little bit of an issue, but the views were so amazing it didn't matter. 100 miles on the east coast is very different to 100 miles on the west coast, you'll find out later. So the first day we started by visiting Fairy Glen Falls. Like many of the walks on this trip, we bumped into one couple and had the place to ourselves in this week at the end of October and start of November. It was magical and the waterfalls were really, really beautiful. These walks are amazing, and the fact that they're only 20 minutes walk from a car park just make them a great thing to do quickly on a day. The next thing we did was visit the town of Dernock. There's a cafe there called Cocoa Mountain Cafe that purports to have the best hot chocolate in the world, and we tried it out. It was pretty damn good. And then we did Big Burn Walk, which has another waterfall at it. We could have gone to Dunrobin Castle on this day, but we chose to just stay outside while the weather was good and enjoy it. And it was a great walk, very similar to Fairy Glen Falls, and highly recommended. You'll notice the roads are all two-lane here. That changes eventually, but this is Brora Beach. We kept making the mistake as well of going to beaches when the tide was in instead of out. So day 4 saw us doing much more driving, 4.5 hours and 150 miles. We started the day by going to John O'Groats. It's quite a sort of bleak area, but there's a beauty in that, and you can see Orkney and the Shetland Isles from the coast. Most tour websites and videos and things will tell you John O'Groats really doesn't have much there, a few shops and a visitor centre and the sign. But we got there really early in the morning, there was pretty much no one there. We got a photo by the sign and we headed off. First place we visited was Dunskirby Lighthouse, which has a view of Dunskirby Stacks, which is just off to the side, and again you can see Orkney and the Shetland Islands. After that we jumped back in the car and we headed up the coast to the real northernmost point, which is called Dunnet Head. The drive there is quite cool, and you start seeing these single lane tracks that you're on for much of the west coast. It was super cold there, but the views were amazing and there was no rain, so we were happy. We got back in the car, and at this point we drove basically across the entire north of Scotland to the east coast to visit Smoo Cave. Part of the reason we didn't really do much across the north of Scotland was so much was closed, so we couldn't get accommodation. It's part of the reason we had such a big driving day. But you soon come into what's called the West Highlands Geopark and things start getting really pretty. A little tip, you have to be creative to make sure that Google follows the NC500. If not, every now and then it'll take you on these random little excursions that are technically quicker but off the main road. But more often than not, there's only one road to be on, and you'll end up driving across lochs on these raised roads and past massive, beautiful expanses of heather and valleys and lochs. Our first stop on the northwest coast was Smoo Cave. It's basically a car park and a small walk down to this cave. It's got some really cool things going inside, and I think you can do a tour. Next up, we went along to Sangor Sands Beach. This is again a really nice beach. We came at the wrong time where the tide is kind of coming in. It was a little bit worrying going down the beach. You felt like you could get trapped there, but it was beautiful. We had it to ourselves. We got a cup of tea from a shop nearby and chilled in the car park looking at the view and listening to Billy Connolly's latest audiobook, which was really nice. From here we drove down the west coast towards Cailescu, and we had our only real stretch of rain. We had Billy Connolly's autobiography playing, it was cosy, and we really enjoyed this drive. Eventually we got to our last stop of the day, which was Cailescu Bridge. This was actually shot on the following morning, but it shows you crossing the bridge and what it looks like in this beautiful loch. The Cailescu Bridge was beautiful, and we arrived in bad weather, so finding a cosy bar with a view of the loch and binoculars and nice drinks was just magical. And in fact, this hotel was probably our favourite place to stay on the trip, the Cailescu Hotel. We had fresh fish from the loch, a cheese board, beautiful desserts, lots of nice wine, and we relaxed. The next day would see us do 4.5 hours and about another 150 miles. We woke up in the hotel, and this was the view. The loch was just stunning. There was mussel boats setting off to go and catch that day's fish. This is what the hotel looks like. We had some nice breakfast, and then we set off on the road. Everybody tells you to do the North Coast 500, East Coast first, and finish on the west because it's much prettier, and I have to say it's true. Just this part of the world with its single lane roads, the coast to your right, the lochs, the mountains, the unspoilt beauty, it's just unbelievable. This October-November time period saw the roads largely empty. We would drive for 45 minutes without someone appearing before us or after us. We felt like we had Scotland to ourselves at times. It was really magical. Although I think I got some good shots on this trip, I can't tell you how little justice they do to the place. You just spent 5 days in awe, gasping as you went round each corner and being more and more shocked at the beauty of the place. I knew Scotland was beautiful, people kept telling me, but unless you go and you see it for yourself, it really is magical. This is Ardvec Castle, which is somewhere you can pull up and walk up to the castle and get some shots. And then we continued on our way to our next hotel. At lunch we stopped in Ullapool, and I had Cullen skink, which is like smoke haddock creamy soup, and it was the best thing I ate on the whole trip. And I had a lot of nice food, but that soup, oh, amazing. As you can see from the photos, the views just get better and better, and this is the west coast, heading towards the Torridon Hotel. Just magical. And the roads would cut between A roads and single track. They say the NC500 is not a racecourse, and absolutely true. You rarely find yourself going above 40 on those roads. You have to slow down. But soon we arrived at the Torridon Hotel. We had seen this hotel mentioned on a TV show, and we had it on a kind of list of places we'd like to stay, and it really was magical. As well as staying in the hotel, you've got the grounds, and we had a little walk around and looked across at the town of Torridon and the Munro in the distance, and they have animals and plants that they serve in the restaurant. Really cool stuff. I think they make their own gin too. Now, we were assured that we would just see Highland cows on this trip, but actually we found it quite difficult, so when we saw them on site at the hotel, that was cool. We ate in the Boat and Muck restaurant. I had oysters and various bits and bobs, and it was another lovely night. We'd left ourselves a lot to do on this last day. From the Torridon we were going to visit the Balakna Bar, which is like a pass, but before we left we took some photos of the inside of the hotel, which we hadn't got the night before. The bar area is really beautiful and it has various lounges and places to sit that are really, really magical. I highly recommend a stay there. And then I took this snazzy picture with Google on my phone. Ooh, look at it. I'll say again how lucky I think we were with this trip. People talk about the busyness of the Highlands in the summer and the midges and all that sort of stuff, but we just had none of it. We had the place to ourselves and we just drove at our own speed, enjoying the view. We had the top down largely for a lot of the time and just enjoying the Highlands and breathing it all in. We were recommended to fill up whenever you see a petrol station in the Highlands, and they were few and far between. Another thing to consider is the fact that daylight hours are quite short during the winter and hotels serve breakfast pretty late, so you need to squeeze a lot in on a day to make the most of this trip. Before long we arrived at the top of the Balakna Bar, and after a terrifying moment where I thought I'd blown up the engine, it turned out just to be a puddle splashing on the exhaust, we set off and drove down. I didn't actually film the drive down because we just wanted to enjoy it for ourselves, but this is near the top and heading down, and the switchbacks are there in front of you, and that's what it's like driving down this beautiful, beautiful road. From here it's kind of the end of the NC500. You're just driving back towards Inverness and then joining the main roads. They're still beautiful, but just not quite as beautiful as what you've seen up until this point, so I really saw kind of the Balakna Bar as the end of the NC500 for us, and from here we drove to another hotel to break up the journey home. This day, however, was 5.5 hours in the car, and a big chunk of it was heading to that hotel, and the rain really came down on this last day. But before long we arrived and we got our place with a beautiful 4-post bed and another pretty view. So that was kind of our trip. In total, I think we did around 1,200 miles. The last day was 5 hours of driving and the last 250. So big numbers, a lot of time in your car, but highly worth it. I would highly recommend Robbie Rome's book and YouTube channel as a guide for doing this NC500, particularly in the winter, because he does it then, and pretty much everything he said on that trip was bang on, and we went to a lot of the places he recommended. And lastly, if you're an MX-5 owner, the MX-5 is a great car to take on this trip. I've got lowered springs on mine and it wasn't too harsh. It was a great nimble little car to go down those tiny roads and really enjoyed the trip.